The town of Blackwood was a quiet, unassuming place, nestled at the edge of a dense forest and far from the noise of the big cities. Life moved slowly here, with children playing in the cul-de-sacs and neighbors greeting each other at the local farmers market. It was a place where everyone seemed to know everyone, except for one man. His name was Dr. Elias Crow. Dr. Crow had arrived in Blackwood a year ago, renting out an old Gothic-style building at the end of Willow Lane. The building had been abandoned for decades, its once bright white paint peeling to reveal gray wood underneath. Vines crawled up its sides, as though nature was trying to reclaim it. The townsfolk had whispered that the building was cursed, but Dr. Crow had transformed it into his private clinic. A brass sign with the words, "Crow Child Psychiatry," hung above the arched doorway, polished and gleaming against the decaying facade. From the moment he arrived, the people of Blackwood didn't quite know what to make of Dr. Crow. He was tall and lean, with sharp features that gave him the appearance of a raven in human form. His dark hair was always neatly combed, and his piercing gray eyes seemed to look straight through people. He dressed impeccably, always in a black suit and tie, with gloves that he never took off, even when shaking hands. There was something both elegant and unnerving about him, as though he belonged to another time. Word of his clinic spread quickly, and it wasn't long before desperate parents began knocking on his door. The town had its share of troubled children, children who couldn't sleep, who screamed through the night, who lashed out violently at school, parents who had tried every other option, from therapists to medication, found themselves sitting in Dr. Crow's waiting room, their last hopes pinned on the mysterious psychiatrist. Dr. Crow's methods were unorthodox, to say the least. He refused to charge money for his services. Instead, he had one peculiar request: a vial of blood from each parent. He didn't explain why he needed it, and the parents who asked were met with a smile and a gentle assurance that it was all part of his process. "Trust is the foundation of healing," he would say in his velvety voice. "If you trust me, I can help your child." At first, people were hesitant. The idea of giving blood to a psychiatrist was bizarre, almost grotesque. But those who took the leap of faith saw results that were nothing short of miraculous. The Andersons' son, who hadn't spoken a word in years, suddenly began chatting animatedly about dinosaurs. The Miller twins, notorious for their tantrums, became the picture of politeness overnight. The transformation in these children was so profound that parents who had once scoffed at Dr. Crow now found themselves making appointments. The waiting room of the clinic was as unusual as the man himself. It was dimly lit, with walls painted a deep, almost black shade of green. Heavy velvet curtains covered the windows, shutting out the daylight. The only sources of light were a series of old-fashioned gas lamps mounted on the walls, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows across the room. A faint scent of lavender and something metallic lingered in the air, making visitors feel both calm and slightly on edge. Dr. Crow's office, however, was an entirely different world. It was bright and modern, with sleek furniture and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with medical texts and journals. On his desk sat a small crystal vial filled with red liquid, its contents catching the light in a way that made it seem alive. Parents rarely noticed the vial, their attention drawn instead to Dr. Crow himself, who exuded an aura of calm confidence. Despite his growing reputation, there were those in Blackwood who didn't trust him. Mrs. Hargrove, the town librarian, was one of them. She had lived in Blackwood her entire life, and had a knack for spotting trouble. To her, Dr. Crow's arrival was no coincidence. "Mark my words," she told anyone who would listen. "That man isn't what he seems." Others dismissed her concerns as paranoia. After all, weren't the children happier? Weren't the families finally finding peace? But Mrs. Hargrove wasn't alone in her unease. A few parents who had visited Dr. Crow mentioned feeling strange after giving their blood. They spoke of headaches, fatigue, and vivid, unsettling dreams. One father claimed he saw Dr. Crow in his dream, standing at the foot of his bed, watching him with those piercing gray eyes. Despite these whispers, Dr. Crow's popularity only grew. The clinic became a beacon of hope for families not just in Blackwood, but from neighboring towns as well. On any given day, the waiting room was filled with parents clutching their children's hands, their faces etched with worry. And Dr. Crow, always calm and composed, assured each one of them that he could help. What no one realized, at least not yet, was that Dr. Crow's cures came with a cost. The children may have been healed, but something was happening to their parents. The fatigue and headaches were only the beginning. Some began to notice subtle changes in their appearances: pale skin, sunken eyes, and veins that seemed darker and more pronounced. Others spoke of a creeping sense of dread that followed them everywhere, like a shadow they couldn't escape. The town itself seemed to change as well. The air felt heavier, the nights darker. Strange occurrences became more common: dogs barking at nothing, lights flickering without reason, and an eerie silence that settled over the streets after sunset. Blackwood, once a peaceful haven, was becoming a place where fear lingered just beneath the surface. And yet, Dr. Crow remained the picture of composure. He continued his work, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the growing unease around him. To those who questioned him, he offered the same reassuring smile and the same cryptic words: "Trust is the foundation of healing." For the Petersons, Dr. Crow was their last hope. Their daughter, Lily, had become a stranger to them, her once bright laughter replaced by screams and sobs. They had tried everything: therapy, medication, even prayer, but nothing had worked. When they heard about Dr. Crow, they dismissed the rumors and the warnings. What choice did they have? As they sat in his waiting room for the first time, clutching Lily's trembling hand, they couldn't shake the feeling that they had just stepped into a trap. But when Dr. Crow emerged from his office, his smile warm and his voice soothing, their fears melted away, if only for a moment. For in that moment, they saw not the raven-like figure that had haunted their nightmares, but a savior, a man who promised to heal their child, a man who, with a single vial of blood, could give them back the life they had lost. They would soon learn, as others had before them, that some promises come at a price. The Petersons were a family on the brink of collapse. Once a happy, loving household, their lives had been turned upside down by their daughter Lily's inexplicable transformation. At just 10 years old, Lily had gone from a cheerful, curious child to a living nightmare. Her once lively hazel eyes now seemed hollow, her laughter replaced by ear-piercing screams that often echoed through the house late into the night. The Petersons had tried everything to help their daughter: therapy, specialists, medication, but nothing had worked. They were desperate, and desperation has a way of making people overlook their better judgment. It had been a particularly bad week for the Petersons. Lily's night terrors had grown worse. She would wake up screaming, clawing at the air as if fending off something unseen. During the day, she would lash out unpredictably, throwing objects, shrieking at her parents, and sometimes speaking in a strange, guttural voice that neither of them recognized. Her violent outbursts had left their once cozy home in ruins. Picture frames lay shattered on the floor, furniture was scratched and torn, and there were faint but unmistakable dents in the walls from objects thrown in fits of rage. It wasn't just their home that was falling apart. Karen Peterson, Lily's mother, had developed a habit of wringing her hands constantly, her eyes sunken from sleepless nights. Her husband, Mark, was no better. Once the pillar of strength for the family, he now looked perpetually defeated, his broad shoulders slumped, and his voice tinged with helplessness. The Petersons had always been proud of their resilience, but Lily's unexplained affliction had tested their limits. One night, as Mark sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, Karen placed a flyer in front of him. It was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding them. Crow Child Psychiatry, it read, followed by a line in smaller font. Healing troubled children with care and precision. Karen, no, Mark said immediately, pushing the flyer away. We've talked about this. That man, there's something off about him. Karen hesitated, her hands trembling. We don't have any other options, Mark, she whispered, her voice cracking. She's getting worse. What if she hurts herself? Or, God forbid, hurts us? Mark didn't answer. He couldn't. He stared at the flyer, his mind swirling with the rumors he'd heard about Dr. Elias Crow. Some parents swore by him, claiming he'd saved their children when no one else could. Others muttered darkly about the price of his so-called cures. A vial of blood? It sounded more like something out of a horror story than modern medicine. Yet, as Mark glanced toward the living room where Lily sat curled in a corner, whispering to herself, he realized they had no choice. The next morning, the Petersons found themselves standing in front of Dr. Crow's clinic. It was even more unsettling in person than it had been in the pictures. The building seemed to loom over them, its darkened windows resembling unblinking eyes. The air felt heavier here, thick and oppressive, as though it carried an unspoken warning. Karen clutched Mark's arm tightly, and even Lily, usually volatile and restless, seemed subdued. Inside, the waiting room was as strange as the stories had described. The dim lighting and the deep green walls made the space feel smaller, almost claustrophobic. A faint scent of lavender hung in the air, though it did little to mask the metallic tang that Karen couldn't quite place. Lily sat on one of the velvet chairs, her small hands gripping the armrests, as though the chair might swallow her whole. Mark couldn't help but notice how quiet she was. Too quiet. Before they could dwell on their unease, the door to Dr. Crow's office creaked open, and the man himself stepped out. He was tall, his silhouette sharp and angular against the light from his office. His suit was immaculate, and his black gloves gleamed faintly as he clasped his hands in front of him. Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, he said, his voice smooth and soothing. It's a pleasure to meet you, and you must be Lily. He knelt slightly, his gray eyes locking onto Lily's. Don't worry, my dear. You're in safe hands now. Karen felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something about Dr. Crow's gaze that unnerved her. It wasn't unkind exactly, but it was far too intense, as though he could see right through them. Please come in, Doctor. Crow continued, gesturing toward his office. Let's talk. Dr. Crow's office was a stark contrast to the waiting room. It was bright and modern, with sleek furniture and a large desk that seemed almost out of place in such an old building. The walls were lined with bookshelves, their contents meticulously arranged. A faint hum filled the air, barely noticeable but impossible to ignore. Dr. Crow wasted no time. He asked the Petersons about Lily's symptoms, his tone professional but empathetic. Karen found herself spilling everything: the night terrors, the violent outbursts, the whispers in that strange, otherworldly voice. Mark, though more reserved, added his observations, describing how their once sunny daughter had become a stranger to them. Dr. Crow listened intently, nodding occasionally. "It's clear that Lily is suffering," he said finally, "but I believe I can help her." Karen's eyes filled with tears of relief. "You can?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Crow smiled gently. "Of course. However, there is one condition." Here it was, the moment they'd been dreading. "I require a vial of blood from each of you," Dr. Crow said, his tone as casual as if he were asking for a signature on a form. "It's an integral part of my process." Karen glanced at Mark, who looked like he might protest, but Dr. Crow continued before he could speak. "I understand that this may seem unusual," he said, "but I assure you it's perfectly safe. Trust is the foundation of healing, and if you trust me, I can help your daughter." Mark's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Karen, on the other hand, nodded hesitantly. "If it will help Lily, we'll do it." The blood draw was quick and clinical, but Karen couldn't shake the strange feeling that came over her as Dr. Crow handled the vials. He held them up to the light, examining them with an intensity that made her stomach churn. When he placed the vials in a small, locked cabinet, she noticed something odd. The cabinet seemed colder than the room itself, faint wisps of frost clinging to the glass. "Excellent," Dr. Crow said, his smile returning. "Now, if you'll leave Lily with me for an hour, we can begin." Karen hesitated, her maternal instincts screaming at her to stay. But Mark placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, and she reluctantly agreed. They stepped out into the waiting room, leaving Lily alone with the doctor. The hour that followed was the longest of Karen's life. She paced the waiting room, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Mark sat silently, staring at the floor, his fists clenched. The faint hum that filled the clinic seemed louder now, almost like a heartbeat, and Karen swore she could hear whispers beneath it. Finally, the door to Dr. Crow's office opened, and Lily stepped out. The Petersons froze, their breath catching in their throats. Lily was smiling, not the hollow, unsettling smile they had grown used to, but a real, genuine smile. Her eyes were bright again, her cheeks flushed with color. She looked like their daughter, the daughter they thought they had lost forever. "She's cured," Dr. Crow said simply, his gloved hands folded neatly in front of him. "Take her home. Enjoy your family again." Karen threw her arms around Lily, tears streaming down her face. Mark, though hesitant, placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, feeling warmth and life where there had been coldness before. For the first time in months, the Petersons felt hope. But neither of them noticed the faint red bruise forming on the inside of Lily's wrist, or the flicker of satisfaction in Dr. Crow's gray eyes as he watched them leave. The Petersons' home had been a war zone for months. Broken furniture, smeared walls, and the pervasive sense of unease had defined their lives since Lily's inexplicable transformation. But now, for the first time, their home was quiet, too quiet. Mark and Karen watched Lily intently as she sat at the kitchen table the morning after her session with Dr. Crow. She was eating her cereal in silence, the spoon clinking against the bowl with a steady rhythm. It wasn't the violent, unpredictable silence they had come to dread, nor was it the eerie muttering or sudden shrieking that had become the soundtrack of their lives. No, this silence was calm, normal, but it wasn't quite right. Lily seemed perfect, too perfect. She chewed her food methodically, each bite spaced exactly the same. Her posture was unusually straight, her hands resting neatly on either side of the bowl between spoonfuls. Even her breathing was unnervingly even, a faint rise and fall that made Karen feel as though she were watching a doll instead of her daughter. "Do you want more cereal, sweetie?" Karen asked, her voice trembling slightly. Lily turned to her, her hazel eyes bright and clear in a way Karen hadn't seen in months. For a moment, Karen's heart swelled with hope. Maybe this really was her daughter again. "No, thank you, Mommy," Lily said, her voice soft and sweet. Then she smiled, a smile so wide, so radiant, that Karen couldn't help but smile back. And yet, there was something about it that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. It was as though the smile wasn't fully her own, like she was mimicking what a smile should be, rather than feeling it. "Are you sure you're feeling okay, kiddo?" Mark asked, leaning forward in his chair. He was doing his best to sound casual, but Karen could hear the tension in his voice. "I'm fine, Daddy," Lily replied. Her tone was cheerful, but it carried a strange finality, like she was rehearsing lines in a play. "I feel perfect. Dr. Crow made me all better." Karen and Mark exchanged a glance. They didn't say it aloud, but they were both thinking the same thing. Something wasn't right. By the end of the day, Karen and Mark couldn't deny the changes in Lily. Gone were the violent outbursts and the screaming fits that had once defined their lives. She no longer clawed at the walls or shrieked in her sleep. Instead, she spent her time drawing pictures in her sketchbook, humming softly to herself as she worked. But her drawings, like her smile, were not what they seemed. Karen had peeked over Lily's shoulder as she worked on one of her sketches that afternoon. At first glance, it seemed innocent enough, a field of flowers beneath a bright sun. But as Karen looked closer, she noticed the unsettling details. The flowers were wilting, their petals blackened at the edges. The sun in the sky was bleeding, streaks of red dripping into the field below. And in the corner of the page, almost hidden in the shadows, was a figure, tall and thin, with dark eyes and long fingers. Karen felt her stomach churn. "Lily," she said carefully, kneeling beside her daughter, "what are you drawing?" "It's a happy picture," Lily replied, her voice light and airy. "It's the field I dream about now. Dr. Crow says it's a good place." Karen tried to smile, but her heart was racing. "Who's the man in the corner?" Lily looked at her mother, her bright eyes narrowing slightly. "That's not a man, Mommy," she said. "That's my friend. He watches me so I can stay safe." Karen didn't press further. She didn't want to upset Lily, not when they'd finally had a peaceful day. But as she walked back to the kitchen, she couldn't shake the image of the figure in the drawing. It felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain, like she had seen it before but couldn't remember where. Over the next week, Lily's behavior continued to improve, or at least it seemed that way. She was polite, obedient, and always smiling. She no longer woke up screaming in the middle of the night, and her temper tantrums were a thing of the past. To an outsider, she would have seemed like the perfect child. But to Mark and Karen, the changes were unnerving. For one, Lily never seemed to sleep. Karen had checked on her one night, peeking through the crack in her bedroom door, and found her sitting upright in bed, staring at the wall. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking, and her lips moved soundlessly, as though she were speaking to someone Karen couldn't see. When Karen asked her about it the next morning, Lily simply smiled and said she had been praying. Then there were the bruises. Faint, reddish marks had appeared on Lily's arms and legs, and no matter how many questions Karen and Mark asked, Lily insisted she felt no pain and had no idea how they got there. The bruises seemed to move, vanishing from one spot only to appear in another. Karen found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with questions she didn't dare voice aloud. And then there was the humming. It was constant now, a low, melodic tune that Karen had never heard before. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was eerie. She would catch herself humming it without realizing, the melody embedding itself in her mind like a parasite. Once, when she asked Lily where she'd learned the song, her daughter tilted her head to the side and said, "Dr. Crow taught me. He says it's a happy song." Mark had been trying to keep his fears at bay, convincing himself that they were imagining things, that Lily was just adjusting after her treatment. But one evening, as he sat on the porch with a beer in hand, his resolve began to crumble. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. Lily was playing in the grass, her laughter ringing out like a bell. It should have been a moment of peace. But then he noticed something strange. Lily's shadow wasn't moving with her. She was twirling in circles, her arms outstretched, but the shadow on the ground remained perfectly still. It was faint at first, but as Mark stared, the shadow began to shift. It grew darker, longer, its edges rippling as though alive. And then, just for a moment, he thought he saw it stretch upward, forming a shape that looked almost human. Tall, thin, with long fingers and dark eyes. Mark blinked, and it was gone. Lily's shadow was just a shadow again, moving in time with her twirls. But the image was burned into his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. As the days passed, the Petersons found themselves questioning everything. On the surface, Lily was cured. She was no longer the violent, troubled child who had torn their family apart. But in her place was someone, or something, that felt like a stranger. Karen began noticing how her own energy was waning. She felt tired all the time, her body heavy and sluggish. Mark complained of vivid nightmares he couldn't quite remember, waking up drenched in sweat. The house, once chaotic and full of noise, was now oppressively quiet. And yet, Lily thrived. She grew stronger, more confident, her smile never wavering. She seemed to glow with vitality, even as her parents felt themselves fading. It was Karen who finally voiced what they had both been thinking. Late one night, as they sat together in the dimly lit living room, she whispered, "Mark, what if we've made a mistake? What if Dr. Crow didn't fix her? What if he changed her?" Mark didn't answer. He didn't have to. The fear in his eyes said it all. The Petersons had hoped for a miracle, and they had gotten one. But as they watched Lily, now so perfect and yet so wrong, they began to realize that miracles often come at a price, and theirs had only just begun to reveal itself. Word of Lily Peterson's miraculous transformation spread through Blackwood like wildfire. Parents who had once whispered their suspicions about Dr. Elias Crow now spoke of him with reverence. The Petersons' story had become the talk of the town. A struggling family restored, a troubled child cured. Dr. Crow, once a figure of mystery and unease, was now heralded as a savior by many. But for those who dared to look closer, there was something deeply unsettling about the sudden wave of hope that had swept through the town. The waiting room of Dr. Crow's clinic, once sparsely populated, now bustled with activity. Parents clutched their children close, their faces etched with exhaustion and desperation. Each family carried their own burdens. Children who suffered from uncontrollable rages, debilitating anxieties, or eerie behaviors that defied explanation. The air was thick with the quiet hum of hope and fear, punctuated by the faint whispers of parents exchanging stories about their children's afflictions. The clinic itself seemed to change with the influx of patients. The once dim waiting room now felt darker, the velvet curtains drawn tighter, letting in no light from the outside world. The gas lamps mounted on the walls flickered more often, casting strange, shifting shadows that made the room feel alive. The metallic scent in the air had grown stronger, almost overwhelming, but no one dared mention it aloud. The promise of healing was enough to keep them quiet. At the center of it all was Dr. Crow, moving through the clinic with his usual calm demeanor. He greeted each family with a warm smile, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, and spoke in the same soothing tones that had won over so many. Yet, to the more observant, there was something different about him. His movements seemed quicker, more deliberate, as though he were energized by the growing demand for his services. His gray eyes, once piercing but measured, now gleamed with a hunger that no one could quite place. One of the first new families to arrive was the Sanchez family. Their 7-year-old son, Diego, had stopped speaking entirely after witnessing a traumatic car accident. For months, he had been silent, communicating only through gestures and scribbled notes. Therapists had been baffled, and his parents were at their wits' end. When they heard about Dr. Crow, they didn't hesitate. Dr. Crow welcomed the Sanchezes into his office, listened to their story, and nodded thoughtfully. As always, his request was the same: a vial of blood from each parent. The Sanchezes, like so many others, were hesitant at first, but their desperation outweighed their doubts. Within days of his session, Diego began speaking again, but his words were strange, disjointed. He spoke of things he couldn't possibly know: distant lands, ancient languages, and people long dead. His parents dismissed it as part of his recovery, but neighbors began to notice Diego whispering to himself in the dark, his eyes fixed on the empty air, as if seeing something no one else could. The Bennetts were next. Their daughter, Emma, had been plagued by chronic nightmares since she was a toddler. She would wake up screaming every night, her voice raw and hoarse, her small body drenched in sweat. Dr. Crow assured the Bennetts he could help, and as always, the price was blood. After her session, Emma's nightmares stopped. She slept soundly for the first time in years, but her parents couldn't ignore the strange drawings that began to appear on her bedroom walls. Sketched in charcoal, the images depicted shadowy figures standing in red fields beneath a bleeding sun. As more families flocked to Dr. Crow's clinic, Blackwood began to change. At first, it was subtle. The town, once vibrant and bustling, grew quieter. The streets seemed emptier, the laughter of children replaced by an eerie stillness. The skies over Blackwood darkened earlier, the sunsets bleeding into the horizon in unnatural shades of red and orange. The air itself felt heavier, as though the town were holding its breath. Neighbors who once greeted each other warmly now avoided eye contact, their smiles forced and strained. Parents whispered among themselves about strange occurrences at home, flickering lights, objects moving on their own, and the unnerving sense that they were being watched. But none dared confront Dr. Crow. He had given them what they wanted. Their children were better. Wasn't that what mattered? Karen Peterson, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. She had stopped sharing Lily's miracle with others, keeping her daughter's increasingly strange behavior to herself. Lily was perfect, yes, but too perfect. She no longer seemed like a child. There was an unnatural precision to everything she did, from the way she spoke to the way she moved. And then there were the drawings, fields of wilted flowers, bleeding suns, and that tall, shadowy figure that appeared in every sketch. Karen wasn't alone in her unease. Mrs. Hargrove, the town librarian, had been keeping a close eye on Dr. Crow's growing influence. She had lived in Blackwood her entire life, and had seen more than her fair share of strange happenings, but this felt different. "There's a darkness in this town," she told Karen one afternoon, her voice low and urgent. "And it's tied to that man. Mark my words, nothing good will come of this." As the number of patients grew, so too did the whispers about the toll Dr. Crow's treatments seemed to take on the parents. Karen noticed it first in herself. She had always been a strong, energetic woman, but now she found herself exhausted by the simplest tasks. Her skin had grown pale, her hands trembling with an unexplained weakness. Mark, too, had changed. He complained of constant headaches and a dull ache in his chest, his usual warmth replaced by a cold, distant demeanor. The same patterns emerged in other families. Parents who had visited Dr. Crow became quieter, their faces gaunt and drained. They spoke less at PTA meetings and neighborhood gatherings, their voices hollow and lifeless. Some avoided social events altogether, retreating into their homes as though ashamed of their deteriorating appearances. Those who dared to question the changes were quickly silenced by the others, their concerns dismissed as paranoia. "Our children are better," they would say. "Isn't that what matters?" But Karen couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that followed her wherever she went. She began to notice strange bruises on her own arms and legs, faint and reddish, much like the ones that had appeared on Lily. They seemed to shift locations overnight, disappearing from one spot only to reappear somewhere else. When she mentioned it to Mark, he brushed it off, but she could see the fear in his eyes. He had them too. One evening, Karen decided to confront Dr. Crow. She had tried to convince herself that the changes in Lily and the other children were nothing more than the side effects of whatever treatment he was using. But the mounting evidence suggested otherwise. Clutching a sketch pad filled with Lily's disturbing drawings, she marched to the clinic, her heart pounding in her chest. The clinic was dark and empty, the waiting room eerily quiet. Karen hesitated at the door to Dr. Crow's office, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. But before she could turn it, the door creaked open on its own. Dr. Crow stood in the doorway, his gray eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Mrs. Peterson," he said smoothly, his voice like silk, "what brings you here at this hour?" Karen froze, clutching the sketchpad to her chest. She wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but the words caught in her throat. There was something about the way he looked at her, something that made her feel as though she were shrinking under his gaze. I wanted to ask about Lily," she stammered finally. She's different." Dr. Crow's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Change is never easy, Mrs. Peterson," he said, "but rest assured, your daughter is happier now. Isn't that what you wanted?" Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the words died on her lips. There was a flicker of movement behind Dr. Crow, a shadow that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. Her breath caught, and she stumbled back, clutching the sketch pad like a shield. Dr. Crow stepped forward, his gloved hand reaching out to steady her. "You're tired," he said gently, his voice almost hypnotic. "Go home, Mrs. Peterson. Rest. Trust me, everything is as it should be." Karen fled the clinic, her heart racing. She didn't know what she had just seen, but one thing was clear. Dr. Crow was not what he seemed. As the demand for Dr. Crow's services continued to grow, so too did the darkness that hung over Blackwood. The town was changing, its people changing, and at the center of it all was the man who promised miracles, at a price no one fully understood. The Petersons had tried to ignore the growing unease that crept into their lives after Lily's miraculous transformation, but the signs were impossible to dismiss. Lily's perfection, once a source of joy, now felt like a mask hiding something far more sinister. Karen's exhaustion deepened, and the bruises on her arms seemed to multiply. Mark, plagued by restless nights, woke each morning with bloodshot eyes and a hollow expression. The house was quieter than it had been in months, yet the silence carried an unnatural weight, like the calm before a storm. As the Peterson suspicions grew, so did the peculiarities in Blackwood. More children were cured by Dr. Crow, but their behavior became unsettlingly uniform. They were all polite, obedient, and eerily serene. Parents whispered about the odd things their children were doing, speaking to empty rooms, drawing strange symbols, or humming the same haunting melody. Even the town itself seemed darker, the air heavy with something unspoken. Karen couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to start. It began with the drawings. Karen had been collecting Lily's sketches over the past few weeks, unable to bring herself to throw them away despite the dread they evoked. Each picture featured the same shadowy figure, a tall, thin man with elongated fingers and hollow eyes, standing in a landscape of withered flowers and bleeding skies. At first, she thought it was a reflection of Lily's trauma, a manifestation of her subconscious. But then she noticed something chilling. The figure was becoming more detailed with each drawing, its features sharper, its presence more oppressive. One night, as Karen sat at the kitchen table sifting through the sketches, she noticed a pattern. The drawings seemed to be leading somewhere, each one depicting a new scene that grew closer and closer to what looked like the front of Dr. Crow's clinic. In the final drawing, the shadowy figure stood in a doorway, holding a small vial of blood in its outstretched hand. Karen's hands trembled as she stared at the picture. She couldn't explain it, but she felt certain that Lily wasn't imagining this figure. It was something she had seen, something real, and whatever it was, it had to be connected to Dr. Crow. Karen approached Mark with her suspicions the next morning, her voice low and urgent. At first, he dismissed her concerns, chalking them up to stress and overthinking. But when she showed him the drawings and pointed out the bruises on their arms, he couldn't deny that something was deeply wrong. "We need to find out who this man really is," Karen said. "Where he came from, what he's doing. There has to be more to this." Mark nodded reluctantly. "If we're going to do this, we need to be careful." If he finds out we're looking into him." He didn't finish the sentence, but Karen knew what he meant. There was no telling how Dr. Crow might react if he discovered their plans. The couple began their investigation at the Blackwood Library, where they combed through old newspapers and public records. It didn't take long for them to uncover strange inconsistencies in Dr. Crow's past. His clinic in Blackwood wasn't the first. He had set up similar practices in at least 3 other towns over the past decade. Each time, he had arrived suddenly, gained a reputation for miraculous cures, and then disappeared without a trace after a year or 2. The towns he left behind were riddled with rumors of unexplained illnesses, disappearances, and deaths. Even more disturbing were the reports Karen found in one of the older newspapers. In a small town called Cedarvale, a family who had visited Dr. Crow claimed to have seen something horrific in his clinic. The father, a man named Richard Graves, described a locked basement filled with vials of blood and ancient books covered in symbols. The family had fled the town shortly after, but their story had been dismissed as a hoax. Karen's heart raced as she read the account. Could the same thing be happening in Blackwood? And if so, what was Dr. Crow doing with the blood? Karen and Mark decided to confront their fears head-on. Late one night, after the streets had emptied and the town was cloaked in darkness, they drove to Dr. Crow's clinic. The building loomed ahead, its dark windows reflecting the moonlight like lifeless eyes. The air around the clinic was colder than the rest of the town, a biting chill that seemed to seep into their bones. Mark jimmied the lock on the back door while Karen kept watch, her breath fogging in the frigid air. The door creaked open, and they slipped inside, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. The waiting room was just as they remembered, dimly lit, with the faint metallic scent hanging in the air. But now, in the dead of night, the clinic felt alive in a way that made Karen's skin crawl. The gas lamps flickered, their flames casting shifting shadows on the walls. They made their way to Dr. Crow's office, their hearts pounding with each step. The room was eerily tidy, the bookshelves lined with neatly arranged medical texts and journals. But as Karen scanned the room, her eyes fell on a small cabinet in the corner. It was made of dark wood, its surface polished to a mirror-like sheen. She recognized it immediately. It was the cabinet where Dr. Crow had placed their vials of blood. Mark tried the handle, but it was locked. "Stand back," he whispered, pulling a screwdriver from his pocket. With a few quick motions, he pried the cabinet open. Inside were dozens of vials, each labeled with a name. Karen's stomach turned as she read the labels. Peterson, Sanchez, Bennett, and more. Every family that had visited Dr. Crow was represented here, their blood carefully stored like some grotesque collection. But that wasn't all. Behind the vials was a small leather-bound book. Karen pulled it out, her hands shaking as she opened it. The pages were filled with intricate symbols and diagrams, accompanied by text in a language she didn't recognize. The drawings depicted rituals involving blood, circles of fire, and shadowy figures that looked disturbingly similar to the one in Lily's sketches. "This isn't medicine," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. "This is something else." Their discovery was interrupted by a faint noise, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to come from beneath them. Karen and Mark froze, their eyes locking in silent terror. The sound grew louder, accompanied by a soft, pulsating light that seeped through the cracks in the floorboards. "The basement," Karen whispered. "There's something down there." They found the basement door at the end of a narrow hallway, its handle cold to the touch. Mark hesitated. But Karen pressed on, her fear outweighed by the need for answers. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. As they stepped into the basement, the humming grew deafening, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate in their chests. The pulsating light illuminated the room in brief flashes, revealing its contents in disjointed glimpses. Shelves lined the walls, filled with more vials of blood and strange artifacts, candles, bones, and jars containing unidentifiable substances. In the center of the room was a large, circular altar inscribed with the same symbols they had seen in the book. And standing before the altar was Dr. Crow. He turned slowly, his gray eyes glowing faintly in the pulsating light. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by something cold and predatory. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice reverberating unnaturally. Karen and Mark backed away, but the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them in the room. The shadows along the walls began to move, twisting and writhing like living creatures. The humming grew louder, the symbols on the altar glowing with an otherworldly light. "What are you doing to our children?" Karen demanded, her voice shaking. Dr. Crow smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Your children are fine," he said. "Better than fine. I've given them peace, purpose, and all I needed was your blood." He stepped closer, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the room. "You see," he continued, "blood is the essence of life. It carries your pain, your fears, your memories. By taking it, I can transfer those burdens to someone else. Your children are free of their suffering because you've taken it on yourselves." Karen's legs buckled as the weight of his words sank in. The fatigue, the bruises, the nightmares. It had all been transferred to them. And yet, that wasn't the worst of it. There was something far darker at play, something she couldn't yet fully grasp. Before she could respond, the shadows surged toward them, and the light in the room went out. The days following Karen and Mark's terrifying discovery in Dr. Crow's clinic passed in a haze of fear and uncertainty. They didn't dare tell anyone what they had seen, not their neighbors, not their friends, not even the other parents whose children had been cured. Who would believe them? The town had fallen under Dr. Crow's spell, and to question him was to invite suspicion. Worse, Karen and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights in their home felt like a warning. But they couldn't stay silent, not when they knew the truth. One evening, as Karen sat at the kitchen table staring at Lily's latest drawing, a haunting depiction of the shadowy figure standing over a circle of fire, Mark placed a hand on her shoulder. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with dark circles, but there was a determination in his expression that Karen hadn't seen in weeks. "We have to stop him," he said quietly. "We can't just sit here and let him do this to more families." Karen nodded, though her hands trembled as she clutched the drawing. "But how? He's not human, Mark. Whatever he is, we can't just walk into that clinic and demand he stop." "We don't have to do it alone," Mark said. "There are others. Parents like us. They've noticed the changes too, even if they're too scared to admit it. If we can get them to listen, maybe we can stand a chance." Karen hesitated, her mind racing. She thought of the Sanchez's, the Bennetts, and the other families who had visited Dr. Crow. Many of them had seemed uneasy, even frightened in recent weeks. Perhaps they too had begun to suspect that something was wrong. Okay, she said finally, but we need to be careful. If he finds out what we're doing. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. They both knew the risks. Over the next few days, Karen and Mark reached out to the families they believed might be willing to listen. It wasn't easy. Many parents were still blinded by gratitude for Dr. Crow's miracles and refused to entertain the idea that he might be anything other than a savior. But a few, like the Sanchez's, were more receptive. Diego's parents had been struggling to understand their son's strange behavior ever since his treatment. His sudden fluency in languages he had no way of knowing, and his whispered conversations with invisible figures had left them deeply unsettled. When Karen and Mark told them about the vials of blood and the dark rituals they had witnessed, the Sanchez's didn't hesitate. "We'll help," Mrs. Sanchez said firmly, "whatever it takes." The Bennetts were harder to convince. Emma had stopped drawing her disturbing pictures, but her parents couldn't ignore the shadows that seemed to flicker at the edges of their vision whenever she was nearby. After much pleading, they agreed to join the Petersons' plan. By the end of the week, Karen and Mark had assembled a small group of parents. They met in secret, huddled in the Petersons' dimly lit living room, their voices low and urgent as they shared their stories and pieced together the truth about Dr. Crow. "He's feeding on us," Karen explained, her voice trembling. "The blood he takes, it's not just for the children. He's using it for something else, something evil." "But what is he?" Mr. Sanchez asked, his face pale. "A demon? A vampire?" "I don't know," Karen admitted. "But whatever he is, we have to stop him. And I think I know how." Karen laid out her plan, her heart pounding as she spoke. The group would confront Dr. Crow at his clinic during the night, when the streets were empty and they wouldn't be interrupted. Their goal was to destroy the vials of blood and the ritual objects in the basement, severing whatever connection he had to their children. It was a risky gamble, but it was the only option they had. "We can't just walk in there," Mark said. "He'll see us coming. We need a distraction." "I'll go in first," Karen volunteered. "I'll confront him in his office and keep him occupied while the rest of you head to the basement." Mark's eyes widened. "Karen, no. It's too dangerous." "I don't care," she said firmly. "If it means saving Lily and all the other children, I'll do it." Reluctantly, the group agreed. They spent hours planning their approach, going over every detail until they were as prepared as they could be. But no amount of preparation could quell the fear that lingered in the room like a shadow. The night was cold and still, the air heavy with the promise of rain. The parents gathered outside the clinic, their breaths visible in the frigid air. Karen clutched a flashlight in one hand and Lily's final drawing in the other, her heart hammering in her chest. Mark squeezed her hand, his grip firm but trembling. "Are you ready?" he whispered. She nodded, though her legs felt like jelly. "Let's do this." Karen entered the clinic through the front door, her footsteps echoing in the silent waiting room. The gas lamps flickered weakly, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. She made her way to Dr. Crow's office, her hand trembling as she turned the doorknob. Dr. Crow was sitting at his desk, his gray eyes fixed on a book filled with strange symbols. He looked up as Karen entered, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Mrs. Peterson," he said smoothly. "What brings you here at this hour?" Karen forced herself to meet his gaze. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. about Lily. Dr. Crow's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. Of course. Please, sit. As Karen took a seat, she could feel the weight of his gaze, piercing and unrelenting. She gripped the drawing in her hand, using it to anchor herself. While Karen distracted Dr. Crow, Mark and the others slipped into the basement through the back door. The air grew colder as they descended the stairs, the humming sound they remembered from before growing louder with each step. The basement was just as they had left it, shelves lined with vials of blood, strange artifacts, and the glowing symbols carved into the walls. At the center of the room was the altar, its surface covered in dark stains that seemed to pulse with an unnatural light. "We have to destroy everything," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible over the humming. "Smash the vials, burn the books, everything." The parents set to work, smashing the vials against the floor and tearing the books to shreds. The air grew heavier with each act of destruction, the symbols on the walls flickering like dying flames. But as they worked, the shadows in the room began to move. Back in the office, Karen was struggling to keep Dr. Crow distracted. His calm demeanor had begun to slip, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "You're stalling," he said suddenly, his voice low and dangerous. "Why?" Karen's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'm just worried about Lily," she said, her voice trembling. "She's been acting strange, and I thought maybe you could explain." Dr. Crow stood abruptly, his shadow stretching across the room. "You shouldn't have come here, Mrs. Peterson," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "And you certainly shouldn't have brought others with you." Karen's blood ran cold. He knew. In the basement, the parents froze as the shadows around them coalesced into a monstrous form, a towering figure with hollow eyes and long, grasping fingers. It let out a guttural growl, the sound reverberating through the room and shaking the very walls. Mark grabbed a crowbar and swung it at the figure, but it passed through the shadow like smoke. The creature lunged at him, its fingers closing around his throat. Upstairs, Karen could hear the commotion. She bolted from the office, only to find Dr. Crow blocking her path. His face had twisted into something inhuman, his gray eyes glowing with malevolent light. "This ends now," he hissed, advancing toward her. Karen didn't think. She grabbed a nearby lamp and hurled it at him. The glass shattered, and flames erupted, forcing Dr. Crow to recoil. She sprinted toward the basement, her only thought to reach Mark and the others. When she arrived, the scene was chaos. The parents were fighting desperately against the shadowy creature, their makeshift weapons useless against its intangible form. Karen spotted the altar at the center of the room, its surface glowing with unnatural light. "The altar!" she shouted. "Destroy the altar!" Mark, gasping for air, lunged toward the altar with the crowbar. With a mighty swing, he brought it crashing down, shattering the stone into pieces. The light in the room flickered violently, and the creature let out a deafening roar before dissolving into smoke. As the altar crumbled, Dr. Crow's screams echoed through the clinic. Karen and the others rushed upstairs, only to find his office empty. The clinic itself began to shake, the walls cracking and the floor splitting beneath their feet. "Run!" Mark shouted, grabbing Karen's hand. The group fled the building just as it collapsed in on itself, the roaring flames consuming everything in their path. They stood outside, watching as the clinic burned, the dark clouds above finally parting to reveal the stars. For the first time in months, the air in Blackwood felt lighter. The children of Blackwood slowly returned to normal, their eerie behaviors fading as the days passed. But the parents who had faced Dr. Crow would never forget what they had seen. They carried the scars, both physical and emotional, of their ordeal, knowing they had stared into the face of something truly evil. As for Dr. Crow, he was never seen again. But the parents couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't truly gone. Somewhere, in some other town, another clinic might open. Another family might find themselves drawn into his web, and another price would be paid. The clinic was in ruins. The flames had consumed the walls, the roof had collapsed inward, and the acrid stench of smoke and ash filled the air. But as Karen, Mark, and the other parents stood outside, gasping for breath and clutching each other for support, the uneasy silence was more oppressive than the destruction they had just witnessed. Dr. Crow's physical form might have been gone, but the sense of his presence lingered. It was as if the darkness that had shrouded Blackwood for months refused to dissipate. The children were no longer visibly connected to whatever power Dr. Crow had wielded, but their parents could feel it. A faint, gnawing dread, like an unfinished cord hanging in the air. And then Karen saw it. Through the smoke and flames, deep within the remnants of the clinic, something moved. A shadow, tall, thin, and impossibly black, stood at the edge of the destruction. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and though it made no sound, Karen felt its gaze pierce through her. "He's not gone," Karen whispered, her voice barely audible. The words sent a chill through the group. Mark followed her gaze and stiffened. "It's still here," he said, his voice trembling. The shadow stepped forward, its form flickering and writhing, as if the firelight was fighting to consume it. With each step, the air grew colder, and the parents could feel the weight of its malevolence pressing down on them. "It's feeding," said Mrs. Sanchez, clutching her son Diego close. "Even without the clinic, it's still feeding off us." Karen's mind raced. Destroying the vials, the books, and the altar hadn't been enough. Whatever Dr. Crow had been, a man, a monster, or something in between, his essence had survived, and unless they acted quickly, it would spread its influence again. As the group stood frozen, the shadow raised one of its elongated fingers and pointed directly at Karen. Her heart felt like it stopped. She clutched the drawing she had brought with her, the one Lily had drawn of the shadowy figure standing in a ring of fire. For weeks, she had dismissed it as a child's eerie imagination, but now she understood. It wasn't a warning. It was a prophecy. She looked down at the drawing, her hands trembling, and saw the details she had missed before. The figure in the drawing wasn't alone. Around the ring of fire were smaller figures, their hands clasped, their faces filled with determination. "The circle," Karen said suddenly, her voice cutting through the fear. "We need to make a circle." "What are you talking about?" Mark asked, his voice panicked. "Karen, this thing is—" "It's still connected to us," Karen interrupted, her voice rising with urgency. "It's feeding off the blood he took. But if we break that connection, if we cut it off, we can destroy it for good." "How?" asked Mr. Bennett, his voice trembling. "How do we break the connection?" Karen held up the drawing. "The circle, the fire, we have to trap it, but it's going to take all of us." The parents quickly gathered what they could from the wreckage. Anything that could hold fire. Broken lanterns, shards of glass, and scraps of fabric that hadn't been consumed by the flames. Karen instructed everyone to stand in a wide circle around the shadow, spacing themselves evenly. It flickered and writhed in the center, seemingly aware of their plan, but it didn't retreat. If anything, it seemed to grow larger, its edges bleeding into the air like ink in water. Karen knelt and used a shard of broken glass to prick her finger. The others hesitated, but one by one, they followed suit, their blood dripping onto the ground beneath their feet. The droplets seemed to sizzle against the earth, leaving faint, glowing marks that connected like an invisible thread. "It's working," Karen said, her voice trembling. "Stay strong." As the parents continued to bleed into the circle, they could feel the pull of the shadow intensify. It twisted violently, its form shifting into grotesque shapes. A face with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth, a clawed hand reaching outward, and then back to the tall, thin figure they had come to fear. It howled soundlessly, the vibrations reverberating through their bones. Karen lit the first flame. She held a piece of fabric soaked in gasoline that Mark had salvaged from their car, and with a trembling hand, she set it alight. The fire burned bright and fierce, cutting through the oppressive darkness. She passed it to Mark, who lit the next section of the circle, and so on, until the entire perimeter was ablaze. The shadow screamed, or at least, that's what it felt like. The air was filled with a deafening silence, a pressure so intense it felt like their ears might burst. It lashed out, its smoky tendrils writhing against the flames, but the circle held. The parents, united by their shared purpose, stood firm, even as their knees buckled and their bodies trembled. "It's weakening," shouted Mrs. Sanchez, clutching Diego's hand tightly. "Keep going." As the flames grew brighter, the shadow's form began to shrink, but Karen could feel it. Something wasn't right. The connection wasn't fully severed. The blood circle and fire had trapped it, but the bond it had formed with their children, and through their blood, still lingered. It needed something more, something final. "I have to go in," Karen said suddenly, her voice steady. Mark turned to her, his face pale. "What? Number Karen? No, you can't." "It's still connected to Lily," Karen said, tears streaming down her face. "To all of them. It's using us to hold on. If we don't sever the bond completely, it'll come back. I have to break it." "Karen, please," Mark begged, his voice breaking. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Karen said, her voice trembling but resolute. "This is the only way." Before anyone could stop her, Karen stepped into the circle. The moment she crossed the boundary, the shadow lunged at her. Its tendrils wrapped around her body, cold and suffocating, but she didn't falter. She gripped the shard of glass in her hand and pressed it to her palm, letting her blood drip onto the ground beneath her feet. "I break the bond," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I give my blood freely, and I take back what's ours." The shadow screamed again, its form convulsing violently. The flames around the circle flared, rising higher and higher until they seemed to touch the sky. Karen's body felt like it was being pulled in all directions, the weight of the shadow pressing down on her chest. But she held on, her mind fixed on Lily's face, her smile, her laughter, the daughter she had fought so hard to save. "I break the bond," she repeated, louder this time. "You can't have them. You can't have her." With one final ear-piercing scream, the shadow exploded into a cloud of ash and smoke. The flames around the circle extinguished instantly, plunging the group into darkness. For a moment, There was only silence, and then Karen collapsed. The parents rushed to Karen's side, but she didn't stir. Mark cradled her in his arms, tears streaming down his face as he whispered her name over and over. The ground where the circle had been was scorched black, the faint glow of the blood marks fading into nothingness. But the air was different now, lighter. The oppressive weight that had hung over Blackwood for months was gone. The children who had been under Dr. Crow's influence began to stir, their eyes clearing as though waking from a long dream. "Mommy?" Lily's voice broke through the silence, and Mark looked up to see her standing nearby, her hazel eyes wide and full of life. "What's wrong with Mommy?" Mark couldn't speak. He could only hold Karen tighter, his heart breaking as he realized what she had done. Karen never woke up. The parents buried her in the town cemetery, her grave marked with a simple stone that read, "A mother's love is eternal." The children of Blackwood returned to normal, their strange behaviors fading over time. The parents, though, would never forget what they had endured, or the sacrifice that Karen had made. The clinic was never rebuilt. The lot where it had stood remained empty, the ground scorched and barren. And though the town slowly began to heal, the parents who had faced Dr. Crow knew the truth. Darkness like his never truly disappears. But for now, at least, their children were safe, and that was enough. The town of Blackwood bore the scars of its ordeal long after the fire at Dr. Crow's clinic was extinguished. The rubble was cleared away, but the lot remained barren, as if nothing could grow where so much pain had been sown. Parents who had once gathered at school functions or community picnics now avoided each other's eyes, their shared trauma too raw to acknowledge. Though life returned to some semblance of normalcy, the shadow of what had happened lingered over them all. For Mark Peterson, life without Karen was a hollow shell of what it had been. He had buried her with trembling hands, unable to believe she was gone. She had been his anchor, his partner in every struggle, and now he was adrift, struggling to care for Lily while grappling with his grief. Lily, for her part, seemed unaware of the depth of her father's pain. She was back to being a bright, cheerful 10-year-old, her memory of the past months fuzzy, as if a veil had been drawn over it. But Mark knew better. The cost of Lily's innocence had been Karen's life, and though she had sacrificed herself to save their daughter, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something of Dr. Crow's darkness had lingered behind. In the weeks that followed the clinic's destruction, the parents who had participated in the confrontation began to distance themselves from each other. They had faced the darkness together, but now the weight of what they had seen and done was too much to bear. Many chose to bury their memories alongside their fears, convincing themselves that the nightmare was over. The Sanchez family moved away, leaving no forwarding address. Diego had stopped speaking the strange languages that had once haunted them, but his parents couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched. The Bennetts withdrew from the community entirely, homeschooling Emma and refusing to let her out of their sight. Blackwood itself grew quieter. The laughter of children returned to the streets, but it was subdued, as if the town was collectively holding its breath. The lot where the clinic had stood became a place to avoid, its emptiness a stark reminder of what had been lost. People whispered about seeing flickering lights there at night, or hearing faint whispers carried on the wind, but no one dared investigate. For Mark, life became a series of tasks designed to distract him from his grief. He poured his energy into taking care of Lily, trying to fill the void left by Karen's absence. He cooked her favorite meals, read her bedtime stories, and helped her with her schoolwork, all the while pretending that everything was fine. But at night, when the house was quiet and Lily was asleep, the weight of his sorrow would crush him. The nightmares didn't help. Every night, Mark dreamed of the circle of fire, of Karen standing in its center as the shadow consumed her. He would wake up drenched in sweat, the echo of her screams ringing in his ears. Sometimes he thought he could feel her presence in the house, her scent lingering in the hallway, the faint sound of her laughter drifting through the rooms. But when he turned to look, there was nothing there. Lily, too, seemed to sense the absence. Though she was her old self in many ways, there were moments when she would stop mid-laugh, her eyes distant, as if she were trying to remember something just out of reach. "Daddy," she asked one evening as they sat together on the couch, "do you think Mommy is happy?" Mark froze, the question cutting through him like a blade. He forced a smile and pulled Lily close. "Of course, sweetheart," he said. "Mommy loved you more than anything. She would be happy knowing you're safe." Lily nodded, her head resting against his chest. "Sometimes I think I can hear her," she whispered. "When I'm falling asleep, I hear her voice. She tells me everything is going to be okay." Mark swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "Maybe she's watching over us," he said softly, though the words felt hollow. As time went on, Mark began to notice small, inexplicable things around the house. Objects would be moved from their usual places, doors left ajar that he was certain he had closed. Lily's drawings, once cheerful depictions of animals and flowers, began to take on a darker tone. She drew strange, swirling patterns that seemed to twist and shift when he looked at them too long. And always, in the background, was the faint outline of a tall, thin figure. "Lily," Mark asked one day, holding up one of her drawings, "why are you drawing this?" Lily tilted her head, her hazel eyes wide and innocent. "I don't know," she said. "It just feels familiar." Mark didn't press further. He didn't want to scare her, or himself. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. Mark often caught himself glancing over his shoulder, certain he would see someone, or something, standing behind him. At night, he would hear faint whispers coming from Lily's room, but when he opened the door, she would be fast asleep. One night, as Mark sat alone in the living room, he felt a sudden chill. The air grew heavy, and the faint scent of smoke filled his nostrils. He turned toward the window and froze. In the reflection, he saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, standing just behind him. When he spun around, the room was empty. Mark began to wonder if Karen's sacrifice had truly ended Dr. Crow's influence, or if it had merely delayed it. The shadow that had consumed her seemed to have left its mark, not just on their family, but on the town itself. It was as if Blackwood had been permanently tainted, its people haunted by the remnants of what they had fought to destroy. One evening, Mark found himself standing at the edge of the empty lot where the clinic had once stood. The ground was blackened and barren, the air colder than anywhere else in town. He knelt and placed his hand on the soil, half expecting to feel a pulse beneath his fingers. "Karen," he whispered, his voice breaking, "if you're still here, if you can hear me, please, give me a sign." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, just as Mark was about to leave, he heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. "Protect her." Mark's heart raced. "Karen," he called out, his voice trembling. "Is that you?" The whisper came again, softer this time, but unmistakable. "Protect her." Mark stood, his hands shaking. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew one thing. Whatever darkness remained, it wasn't finished with them. Despite the lingering shadows, Mark resolved to move forward. He enrolled Lily in art therapy, hoping it would help her channel her emotions. He started volunteering at the local community center, trying to rebuild the connections he had lost. And though the weight of Karen's absence never fully lifted, he found strength in the memory of her sacrifice. Blackwood, too, began to heal. The parents who had fought Dr. Crow carried their scars quietly, finding solace in the knowledge that their children were safe. The lot where the clinic had stood remained untouched, a silent reminder of the price they had paid. But every so often, on quiet nights when the wind blew just right, the people of Blackwood would hear faint whispers in the air. Some said it was just the wind. Others believed it was the voice of something darker, waiting for the right moment to return. And in the Petersons' home, as Lily slept soundly in her bed, Mark sat by the window, watching the shadows. He couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, out there, Dr. Crow, or whatever he had been, was waiting. But no matter what came next, Mark vowed to protect his daughter. He had lost Karen, but he wouldn't lose Lily. Not again.